We're a group of researchers and practitioners who are working together to generate and create and share research on community college student pathways in STEM and working closely with the STEM program. We have an ongoing webinar series that today is part of, as well as research projects and other partnerships and other workshops and things that are focused on understanding how low-income, academically talented students navigate pathways in STEM fields. So we're really excited about all the work that we have to share and super excited about bringing folks together on webinars like this to share research and talk about practice. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We're recording the webinar just so that it can be shared with others who might not have been able to join us today so they can watch and listen later. We're asking folks to keep off our cameras for the duration of the webinar, but encourage everybody to ask any questions or provide comments throughout in the chat, and we'll answer them throughout the presentation. And our presenter will also indicate when there's good times for conversation and for discussion, and we'll kind of go from there. But definitely, as thoughts occur to you, feel free to put them in the chat as we typically do. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Becky Wai-Ling Packard. She is a professor of psychology and education at Mount Holoyoke College, and previously served as Associate Dean of Faculty and Founding Director of the Teaching and Learning Initiative, and the Director of the Weissman Center for Leadership. Dr. Packard's studies on mentoring conversations help practitioners build a collective toolbox to support STEM student success. And we're just so thrilled to have you with us today to share your work and to further this discussion with our group. So I'm going to turn things over to you, Becky, to lead us in the discussion and share your really interesting work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me. And thanks for folks tuning in. We said it's such a busy time, and I feel very welcomed by this group and really happy to share, I hope, some food for thought. Guessing that many of the folks listening are people that value mentoring and are actively engaged in mentoring and have a lot of skill and knowledge. So my hope is that I can, like I said, just put forward some contributions that might resonate with some of the practices you're already undertaking, or might give you some insight into things you might also like to try. So I am going to be sharing my screen, and so then depending on how your screen is set up, I might become very small or you can't see me. So I thought I'd just take a minute and say, in terms of my knowledge around STEM projects and thinking about this network, I actually have sat on a number of advisory boards for projects like these, but also had an STEM at our institution. And I think just more generally, not just for the STEM community, and not certainly just for community college pathways, students in these pathways, I think there's a lot of interest in how we support cohorts of students, peer mentors, and also faculty and professional staff mentoring. So I think that there's a lot that I'll be talking about that I think is going to be relevant as you think about both preparation for mentoring, but also ongoing practice. So I guess it's in that spirit I thought about what to share with you today. And like I said, I have some slides prepared. I have some segments of the material, and I'll just kind of see what the appetite is in terms of pausing to have comments or questions. And, please do go ahead and drop those in the chat at any point along the way, and make sure that you're a part of the discussion. Okay, so now let's see, let me go back to my sharing. Make sure that you can see that.
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much. And so thinking about these mentoring moments and helping students tune into feedback. So I've got kind of a little bit of both. So a little bit of the mentoring moments and a little bit about feedback in particular, because I've found that this topic in recent years, it's both a bit about what I'm studying now, but also it's what people most grapple with as they think about what is supportive mentoring when we actually have to give critical feedback in particular. Can we do that in ways that are constructive? And so just kind of a little bit, thank you so much. I know you gave a little bit of background about me, but I thought I'd just say, been on the path for a long time. So I'm in my 26th year at Mount Holyoke. on the faculty and have been at this really since, in terms of studying mentoring, I hate to say I was even studying it as an undergraduate, but that in my time as a faculty member and in the support that I've received through different grants and different projects, I have been focused on career and technical education pathways and also community college transfer pathways now for a very long time, really the duration of my career. And that my focus on mentoring has really spanned that in the entire arc of my career, looking at both how people get into different career pathways, how they transition from community college into a receiving four-year institution, and what can happen that can help smooth that pathway in terms of the types of mentoring. And then for a number of years, I've focused on inclusive computer science, peer mentoring in particular, and then also looking at partnerships with industry mentors. So, and then now I've been focused a lot on building sustainable and strong STEM mentoring ecosystems. And so I'll kind of touch on not all of these projects, but it's just more to say that there's a lot of different contexts that I've been looking at mentoring and conceiving of mentoring, both at the micro level, really at that interaction level. How do we really maximize the interactions we're already having for the benefit of both ourselves, if we are the mentors, but also for the students or our colleagues that we are aiming to mentor, but also thinking about these different roles in this broader ecosystem. So I really, kind of look at the location of where the mentoring's happening, and that even if in our programs or projects or teams we're doing amazing mentoring, the fact is there are still these there can be very hostile STEM climates that our students and our colleagues and ourselves are traversing. And so it is really important that we both, I guess, affirm and validate the contributions that we may be making in these programs, and also recognize some of their limits when we are not working together as a bigger ecosystem, working together toward student success or racial equity or other kinds of goals that often bring us to this work. And actually, starting in January, I'll actually be a program director at the National Science Foundation as a rotator in the Division of Undergraduate Education. So I'll be able to look more closely at some of this work at the national level. So in terms of some of the pieces I'm going to lift up today, thinking a bit about the power of mentoring moments, micro validations, digging into critical feedback, and then, like I said, a little bit on the ecosystems. So there should be plenty of time for people to interject and bring forward some ideas, whatever you would like to hear more about or would like to share. And so the first part I just wanted to lift up is thinking about the power of mentoring moments. And so I'm a real advocate for thinking, both about deliberate, intentional, structured mentoring programs, but often the mentoring that we're talking about, there are these small moments or small interactions that I guess, connect or pull together or accumulate that can really have the impact. So we could set up a program, for example, for mentoring, but it could be that the person that is assigned to be the mentor, or whether that's a peer mentor or a faculty mentor or a research mentor, it could be just because we've assigned that person to be a mentor, that's not necessarily where the student, let's say, is receiving the mentoring from. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of mentoring moments and its connection to identity recognition. And so in terms of today, it's a little bit out of the scope to cover all of the challenges and barriers, but in terms of the groups that I have focused my career on, really first generation, low income students of color who are in community college transfer pathways. And like I said, early on, I was looking at career and technical ed, which some of those pathways were within community colleges and some were in other settings, including for-profit CTE programs and high school programs as well. And so really thinking about the community college transfer pathway as really such an important, promising pathway, because our community colleges are serving more first generation, more low income, more students of color, more parents. Obviously this group knows that, but there are many barriers in terms of time and money. Sometimes students, especially when they transition into the four-year institution, it's not like everybody's wearing a t-shirt that signals that they were a transfer. They don't often know who their peers are. So there can be a lot of isolation or feelings of disconnection, a lack of belonging. And so, at least in my research, which looked at in the state of Massachusetts, I focused on a number of community colleges in our state and followed students into their four-year institutions, but also by sitting on a number of advisory boards that focus on this exact project. I have learned that it's obviously not just at the Massachusetts level, and certainly it's across the whole national level, that there are many barriers facing students, whether that's in the classroom, not necessarily finding their professors to be approachable, not necessarily being able to access a lot of the student services that are intended to be for all students, but that if you're a working student, you might show up and the office is closed if they don't have wider hour availability, for example. The other things that we know from the literature that many people are well aware of microaggressions and these daily interactions that students recount, and that, the thing I'll just say is I feel like this is now very common knowledge across, not just in educational spaces, in STEM spaces, across different institutional types. But I think that the way that those contribute to really a negative climate for students as they are trying to, again, move from a community college setting, let's say, into a four-year setting. They may be in an environment where they were feeling very centered and where they had a lot of peers or faculty who believed in their potential, and then sometimes traverse into the four-year institution where they, whether it's peers making comments or sometimes actually in the instructional environment or in other places, that they feel that they are marginalized or they're disparaged in certain kinds of ways. And it's really important, and I'll show this in some subsequent slides, that because students, obviously we bring an intersectional perspective to this, there isn't a monolith of community college transfer students. So we're really talking about lots of different identities that students are holding. And so I think this idea of how you find a community that is really rooting for you and supporting you really drives home why mentoring initiatives and programs are important. And also they can, as I said, can sometimes be insufficient on their own in the face of a broader ecosystem that maybe isn't pointing in the same direction. The other piece I just want to, just a couple more slides to sort of lay a little bit of the groundwork. I have relied consistently on Carlone and Johnson's model of looking at identity recognition as an important component of STEM persistence. And in this work, they acknowledge the prior literature on student interest and student capability or their sense of competence in the field, but that without identity recognition, which I have another slide to explain what it is, people who have been historically excluded or who are minoritized, whether that's based on race, based on gender, based on socioeconomic status, a combination of factors, LGBTQIA, there's lots of different identities that students with disabilities that may not feel that they belong. And I think our community college transfers often rely on identity recognition to feel like they have a place at the table. And this is what they say in terms of identity recognition. They say, one cannot pull off being a particular kind of person, enacting a particular identity, unless one makes visible to or performs for others one's competence in relevant practices. And in response, others recognize one's performance as credible. And this is what they mean by identity recognition. It's that there are people in the environment, so the mentors, the teachers, the instructors, the PIs in the lab, if they don't see your performance as credible and sort of make note of that, then it can be very difficult for students to come away feeling that they belong, that they should continue to persist. And while this may be important more generally, it's disproportionately important for, in this case, they studied women of color, but I've used this framework in thinking about community college transfers of many different identities. And so that's why I talk about mentoring moments. And so I'm just going to take just one more minute to lay this groundwork before I then start to show you some instances of practice, like what this would look like in practice in terms of identity recognition. For me, I focus on a working definition of mentoring that focuses on the daily interaction level. I just showed you a number of daily interactions that are in the spirit of microaggressions. There are also daily interactions that are in the spirit of mentoring, that we have moments where we feel lifted up, we feel respected, we feel valued, we feel we matter, we feel we're making progress. That's the type of mentoring moment that I'm talking about. That mentoring can refer to a developmental relationship that supports or grows the learner. I use a constellation model, which is very consistent in the literature, which means it just involves a lot of different people. So even if we are in a mentoring program or we are assigned a mentor or we have a peer mentor, we also are embedded in a broader system where we should have access, in theory, to lots of different mentoring opportunities, at least at the interaction level. And so mentoring refers to a collection of interactions that provides a function. That function might be research, skill, or academic support, grant getting, socio-emotional support. So we sort of think about what the collection of mentoring interactions is leading us to. And it's the mentoring that's predictive of positive outcomes. So it's not necessarily that mentoring is magic, but mentoring is associated with and often predictive of academic progress, retention, and transferring to a four-year institution. So I'll just pause there for a second before I move into then the shift from the microaggressions to thinking about mentoring as micro validations. Like if we want to think about mentoring moments versus necessarily mentoring programs, which mentoring programs may be necessary to produce a lot of mentoring moments. But there are also lots of other places where those mentoring moments can happen. I'll just pause there a second and see if there's anything that anybody wants to pause about in the chat. Feel free to drop anything in there if there's something that you want me to, you want to share at all. There are, yeah, thank you so much. A great question about were there other findings outside of the recognition piece. There's a lot. I just want to say there is a lot in this area, and I think we're really seeing it both at a disciplinary level. So we talk about STEM in this broad sense, but of course, a lot of the work I've done both in engineering identity and in computer science identity is that we've seen this uptake in the literature, especially in the last decade. And so this particular framing of identity, of course, there's self-identity, so how someone sees themselves, their self-concept, and their own developing identity. And I'm looking at a little bit at how the recognition piece, because I focus on mentoring, so there's more to it. But for me, the part that resonates in the mentoring literature is what is the role of other people in how we then develop, or our students develop, their science identity. And so that's where, in particular, the recognition from others can be so important in that. Yes, and I will, and thank you. There's another question, and yes, you can also message me individually. I am going to go to the critical, so we will talk a little bit about how do we, so I'm starting a bit with the validation, and then I am going to flip to the critical, because I think that's the piece that people struggle with the most, is that sometimes actually what somebody needs to advance is to be told that their work is not good enough, but that they're capable of doing better. And so I will make sure that we address that, and I have a whole segment on that piece of it. Yes. So it is absolutely necessary. And also there's a lot of complexity in that messaging if we want our messages to be taken up. That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So we will definitely get there. So I'll start. I'll do just a few in that spirit of the positive, kind of the affirming piece of it. And I guess the main reason why I think it's worth talking about micro validations is because I think we often underestimate daily moments, little interactions or comments that go a long way. Now, I have visited, I would say, at least 100 different college campuses. And in these visits with campuses, I often get a chance to speak with students if I'm there as part of a visit. And it's very interesting. So separate from the research literature, which backs this up, but just even talking to students about moments that they remember, it's funny because we never get, it's not like we get a thank you note for some offhand comment we made in the margin of a paper or at the end of a lab meeting. But it's funny how much it's those moments. And if we think about it, we both remember, of course, harsh moments that sting, but we do also remember little moments. And so I wanted just to take a few slides just to talk to you about micro validations, daily interactions that convey a person does belong to a community or is capable of excelling in a particular environment. And the reason why these are so important in that spirit of identity recognition is because we are in climates and in contexts where particular groups, so Black, Latin, Indigenous, low income, non-traditional, students with disability, all of these different groups are often told on a daily basis that they don't belong. There's so much literature on this. It's not always overt. Sometimes it's just the way a space is set up. Side comments or looking around and not seeing anybody who looks like you or not knowing the pathways that people have gone through. And so I just want to make sure that this audience doesn't underestimate the power of micro validations. And it's a little bit different. I'm not actually using the language of micro affirmation. It's actually these micro validations, which aligns with recognition. That is, when are you making progress? Do you belong to this community? Is there something about your behavior or something about your presence that is making a contribution? And so it's really kind of validating your presence versus necessarily saying you're just like a good person. Okay. And so this is a study from a while ago that when I was starting my work on community college transfer, but I have actually seen this lifted up by a number of ongoing projects right now across multiple states where people are working with community college transfer students. And so what we did was we looked at hundreds of students in community college settings who were just gearing up for their transfer. And upon their transfer, we asked them, who was the most important faculty member who made a difference in your decision to transfer? And so we had a whole list of faculty who were named, and there were definitely people who were named dozens and dozens of times. And then there were people who were also named, but once or twice. So these were all good faculty who obviously had done some good work to kind of get somebody on the path to transfer. And then we surveyed the faculty about their behavior, and we asked them about how much time do you talk about transfer with students, and how often do you do that in a classroom setting, and how often do you do it in a one-on-one setting? And what we found were the group of faculty who were named by dozens and dozens of students, which we could think of as super mentors, you might think that they were spending a lot more time. And what we found was no, actually, their strategy was that they were more apt to embed advising messages in class to whole groups of students. They would say things like, this event is coming up, for scientists on Tuesday, you should consider attending it. So we asked them how long they spent. We asked them, so there was no difference in super mentors' expansion of time, how much time they expended, compared to really good mentors who were still doing great work, but were only named by 1 or 2 students. But those individuals were more apt to provide this kind of encouragement or information to students in one-on-one interactions in their office. So if you had a student kind of waiting for you and they follow you back after class to talk about these things, we saw more of that. The amount of time was the same spent. And I think this is the piece where, of course, the one-on-one is very important, but there are many reasons why, especially first generation college students, might not follow a professor back to their office. In a lot of ways, they may be, and that's been shown in the literature around the use of office hours. And so as we start to think about strategies of embedding mentoring moments, we have to think about places like our classrooms and how we can partner, not necessarily for the professor to provide that advice, but also these are places where having partners in the broader institutional context be a guest, and allow them to kind of talk to and advise the students, because this might be the only place where some students hear those messages. And so that's one piece I just wanted to share as an example. And then I wanted to return to this idea of recognition. This is something I've taken up both in advising contexts, looking at community college transfers experiences in advising, and places where they did not experience identity recognition. Instead, they experienced identity marginalization. This is one example. After disclosing her Section 8 housing status in order to navigate an administrative matter, her faculty advisor's attitude was unsupportive when she wanted to take on a thesis. He said, people in your situation, do you really want to take on this work? I felt as if the advisor is like this oppressor on campus. And I think this is very common. In this case, the students that we drew from in terms of these community college transfer students, as I said, had a wide variety of identities. So we had students of color who also were students with disabilities who were also non-traditional students. We had white first generation college students who were parents, so there are a lot of different kinds of identities. And when you're sitting across from a student, you might feel like you're trying to encourage them, but in some cases, this is that line of, I think the spirit of this advisor was to try to help, but the way it came across was that for students like you, these opportunities, they're meant for somebody else. And so in terms of what does identity recognition look like, it can be little small things. She asked me to be a TA the next semester. I couldn't believe it. Or I asked a question in the seminar and people engaged with my idea. It's the sense of being taken seriously, right? Or a week later, my advisor sent me an email sharing an event that was coming up that was connected to what we had talked about. So it's the sense that somebody was thinking about where I was going and what I was doing. And the reason why I opened with the specific example of just sharing some things in class is that we are reluctant, I think, sometimes to encourage in a more blanket way, because we want to make sure we know a student is very committed and has what it takes. But I would also say, so that is true. And also the research supports the idea that a number of students may not be comfortable showing and seeking out certain kinds of information, that they might not even know what questions to ask. And so I'm actually reminded, I won all of those grants, from NSF, from Microsoft, from Google. And I'm a first generation college graduate, even though I'm not a community college transfer. And the way I got involved with undergraduate research is I overheard another student asking my professor about it. And because I'm a great eavesdropper, I ended up getting involved in a summer research program for students of color and first generation college students. And that obviously changed my entire life trajectory, you know, and I won the presidential award from the White House for early career scientists and engineers. So when I think about what it was like for someone like me growing up in a working class family, being first gen, that I got involved with undergraduate research because I overheard another student asking about it. I do think there's a lot of power in this identity recognition framework. The other thing I wanted to highlight just in this segment before I shift to the critical feedback is the importance of preparing TAs and peer mentors. So a lot of the work I've done, and it's probably because I have launched our teaching and learning center at our campus, is that I've done a lot of faculty training. So I do a lot of faculty mentor training. But I also, through the work we did through Google and my ongoing work in inclusive computer science education, is we started to look at these other places where we were embedding TAs, peer mentors, other peer leaders, and thinking about what kind of inclusive teaching or inclusive mentoring, culturally sustaining mentoring, other forms of microaggression training, talking across difference, belonging, active learning, active listening, what kind of training beyond the technical training are they receiving? And so we actually built this curriculum that supported inclusive teaching in the computer science introductory sequence. And a number of campuses, because it was open source, you know, were able to take that up and implement it. And so, and actually that's how we ended up connecting with Microsoft, is they found our curriculum and they actually wanted to adopt it and have it, they wanted to leverage it actually for their mentor training. And then now they're onboarding for new employees. So it's actually part of the Learn platform. So there's a lot of this kind of knowledge about, again, not just micro validation, but actually understanding that people of different social identities hear similar messages in different ways, and that there are some groups that are not consistently receiving validating messages about their presence or their belonging. And so it's just to mention that that's very important in how we prepare our mentors, including our peer mentors. Because I think we could assume that people just know how to do that. And that's not necessarily true. Just because people are students too doesn't mean that they know this literature or the practice. Okay, so I know this group is very interested in critical feedback. So what I will do is I'm going to share my next slide, which is a situation. And then we could pause and see if there are comments in the chat about how you would deal with the situation. Okay, and then I'll unpack it a little bit. So the situation is called the lab meeting. The student arrives to the lab meeting. Together, you discuss all they need to do next. After, you feel good about the conversation. Days pass and the student follows up to seek help. They share, I've had such a busy 2 weeks and now I'm a bit stuck. They've remembered one of the steps they were supposed to take, but they confused multiple requirements. Now the project is behind schedule. So I'll just pause there a minute and think a little bit about how we would give feedback. Is this a mentoring moment? Is this a mentoring opportunity? But we really cannot be validating, right? We cannot necessarily say, you did a great job, right? But we have to think about how we're going to frame what happened here. And also we want to make sense of what happened. So I'd be interested in some of your thoughts about how to deal with this kind of situation. And I'm sure there are other kinds of situations where somebody does something, even the way they collected the data, the way they analyzed the data, it could be that it was wrong or there was, you know, a major error that was involved. And I'm curious about how people would manage that situation. Okay, well, I will keep going, but one thing I'd be interested in from the group is as I start to unpack this, I'd be interested in your observations or your critiques or the edges of this, because I think that it is exactly this moment of giving the critical feedback that we really want to make sure that we have some thoughts about the way that it can be received. The part we could also add is, let's say this is one of the students, this is one of your scholars, this is a student that has a lot going on. You don't want to beat them up, right? But we're not necessarily helping students when we don't tell them. And I would say this goes as well when I was associate dean. This actually doesn't help department chairs. It doesn't help early career faculty. It doesn't help people when people are not doing well and we don't tell them and give them candid feedback or constructive feedback. So the first thing I wanted just to point out is that we think we gave perfect directions. So there is something in the scenario where the mentor or the lab director, the PI, sort of assumes that the student got it wrong. And I think that the part that we also know, and I just want to remind people, is that, even robots and computers have bugs in their code, and that's sometimes because we put them there, right? So we think we did it perfectly, but in fact, we might have miscommunicated something. That's always possible. Now, I think in this scenario, the student said that they got stuck and they forgot a few things, or, they got tied up. The other thing I wanted to share is that meetings are chances to coordinate meeting. And so this is something that I've been digging into the literature on how we coordinate meeting. So if I share something with you and I'm an expert and I know kind of what the next steps are that need to be undertaken, this is actually from one of our videos we created for Microsoft. And if people are interested, it's all open source on YouTube. And we actually also have an entire set in Spanish. So I'm just sharing that. So this is kind of thinking about how when people are engaging in dialogue, there can be misunderstandings. So somebody thinks they say something and the other person is sort of thinking about a whole bunch of things, not just the one thing. So different ideas get activated. And so when we think about having meetings or laying out feedback that we might be providing, these are really chances to coordinate our meaning with one another. And so from that spirit, we want to think about strategies like being concrete and specific, especially on due dates, sometimes using a shared doc in the meeting so that you can see some of the notes, especially for a novice that they might be taking to get a sense of what they were taking away, or having them send an email with their understanding of their next steps. I'd like you to share back with me what you're going to do next. And sometimes even putting bands of time around that. Like if you find that this task is taking you more than 5 hours, I would like you to circle back to me. So I have found that sometimes like what I'm imagining is absolutely not what the other person heard. And I think that's just something, it seems like just basic communication, but I actually think this is where some of it can go wrong in terms of a mentoring opportunity coming away just feeling more like criticism. And so there's a real missed opportunity here. Yeah, I'm just going to call out some of the things that I'm seeing. Yep. So really affirming, yep, help them. This is great. So I'm just looking at what you have. Yep, I would examine how. Thank you so much for these. So what I'm seeing in the chat is thinking about the timeline, exactly, kind of making sure that it doesn't go by for 2 weeks, that they understand there's a check-in expected sooner. How did I provide the directions? Help them set their own goals. Students are whole people. This is great. Being available for feedback. And the other thing we can talk about is that, is there a peer mentoring infrastructure? So I do often pair students with each other if I can, so that there is another person, because it sometimes is not feasible for the mentor to be in lockstep, in terms of the level of mentoring. So we think about ways that we're setting up an infrastructure for folks to be able to check their work or check their understanding along the way. Once people get to a certain point, it's often the case that they can execute certain tasks so easily after they've done it before. But the part that I want to talk about, so we kind of, once we have that kind of broad base understanding, is really looking at feedback across identity groups. And so what we found in the research is that there's a lot of noise when critical feedback is given. There's actually been a lot of research on this, and I've been just doing more and more looking at this. In a study that I'm finishing now, I've been looking at tech supervisors giving feedback to interns, summer interns, and kind of how they're getting that feedback. And I've done lots of work in the classroom, kind of from the faculty, and certainly the peer mentoring work that we've done as well. And in terms of the basis for the research around this is that the minute you start giving the critical feedback, if there's an identity difference between the feedback provider and the feedback receiver, there can be some confusion. What is this about? Is this because I'm a person of color? Is this because I come from a low-income background? Like, kind of like, why are you being so tough with me? Or why are you criticizing my work? And so people might be trying to make sense of what is this messaging really about? And there's some evidence that clarifying why you are giving the feedback in the very beginning, like, I just want to tell you, I would like to give you this feedback because I know you can do better, or I know that this is really important to you. This project's really important to both of us. And so I really want to give you this feedback, and that's why. And there's something about that then can lift, right? There's sort of a tuning into the feedback that becomes possible because now I know it's not just about me. This has also been shown in group settings. So if you're able to give group level feedback to say, listen, everyone is going to be submitting their work, but if I see things that are wrong, I just want to make it clear that's because I need, I need you to do really amazing quality work. And so I'm not helping you if I don't catch some things that are wrong right from the get-go. So you may, I need to see kind of your process so that I can help you fine tune. So then later people are not sitting alone going, oh, why am I singled out? Why did they come after me in this way? I'm so embarrassed. I think I will just not go back to that team. And so that's what I have here is that I want your plan to be successful. I know you can do better. That's why I want to give you this feedback. Something needs to change so you can get to where you want to go or so that this project can advance. The other thing the research suggests is that asking before giving the feedback is very important. This is because it enlists the other person as a collaborator. Sometimes the person, like I said, is just shutting down. They feel terrible that they missed a number of steps. They got something wrong. Again, this feeling of embarrassment or feeling defensive. Just pausing and asking, are you open to trying something new? Or is this a good time to talk about this? Sometimes people say, actually, I can't even take it in right now. So I'd like to press pause. Could we schedule another follow-up meeting to work on this? Yes, absolutely. Thanks for these comments. I really appreciate them. Thinking about some of the strategies of having shared docs and clarify the feedback. So I really think that this pausing and asking, this also works at home. Just want to say, if you have close relationships and right, they put their towel on the floor and people say, well, is this really about the towel on the floor? It's like, hey, is this a good time to talk about some changes I'd like to make? And sometimes people are like, listen, I cannot take that in. I cannot take 1 ounce of criticism today, but I'll be ready tomorrow. The other thing that's just emerged from the research literature is a caution about glossing over problems. I think that there's so much, and I think that's maybe some of the questions about constructive criticism, is that there's so much positivity, like mentoring has to be positive. Students feel shame or guilt when praise feels unearned. So this actually has been shown not just in adults, it's even been shown in children. And so there's a sense that there's negative emotion, even when someone gets a lot of positive kudos, if they're like, why are you giving me kudos for something that was so easy? I really don't want you to give me kudos unless I've really made progress. So it can be maybe more accurate to frame it as, this is a process that's going to take some time. I want you to be prepared for an iterative process. We're going to get a lot of things wrong, and we're working to really get in sync with one another. The other thing I just wanted to share, because this is a paper that I had just come out, even though it's in the STEM classroom, I think it's very useful for thinking about our lab teams or thinking about our cohorts or our networks that we're pulling together. And in a lot of these settings, we are not in the space. It's actually the peers. There's a cohort or a team that's working together. And we have to consider whether we've prepared them for working together across different identities. And so this paper is about preparing for identity tensions in the active learning STEM classroom, but it can also, like I said, be applied. And the example I'm going to give from the paper is actually from a biology lab that it did not go well. And this is the way the paper opens. This is the professor, would look at you like, oh, this is the student. Why are you sitting next to me? I come to lecture where I have to turn to a partner every day, and there's no partner that wants to talk to me. And this is a student that identifies as Black and queer. And we actually had students of different identities in the paper talking about what it was like. And it builds off a literature that has grown significantly around the risks that students take when they turn to their neighbor or they work in teams in the STEM classroom. And so this is what the student goes on to say. That's the thing. We have two white professors. They're not seeing the lens that I'm seeing, and they're not watching for what I'm watching. It's the microaggressions. It's not the macroaggression. I think they were expecting someone to call me a slur, and I'm expected to sit next to somebody. So it's really this idea that these professors actually in these classes had really affirmed the commitment to a classroom community, but that still there were students that experienced marginalization and exclusion from their peers. And I just wanted to also share what the professor had to say about this situation, which they actually brought up on their own in their interview when asked, were there any frictions or difficulties in implementing active learning? The professor recalled a recent meeting with a lab instructor regarding a situation involving 3 students having a conflict with another student in the lab. The professor said, I asked, isn't that one student a Black student? This sounds like exclusion. We wondered if the student should file a bias incident report. While the lab instructors implement group contracts in lab, Haley's professor recognized that she does not do any preparation for peer interaction in the lecture portion and wondered aloud if she should offer microaggression training for all students in the course. So I'm not necessarily advocating for that, but I am thinking about this broader mentoring ecosystem and how even if we as mentors or our peer mentors are doing a great job, there's this broader context that we're engaging in. And if you take my spirit of mentoring moments seriously, that means that at the interaction level, we cannot overlook the peer-to-peer and thinking about some of the contexts where we could infuse what is typically reserved for as mentor training to be more expansive. And that's actually in our work with Microsoft, that's what they said. We had you train our mentors, these software engineers, and then the software engineers wondered why they weren't having this training as part of their teams in the way that they work with one another. And so the last piece I will highlight, which is very brief, is this ecosystems perspective. So that if you wanted to learn more, I just wanted to share that these are my colleagues, Doctors Joy Mondisa at the University of Michigan and Baranda Montgomery, who had been at Michigan State for many years and is at Grinnell College. And we've worked on this STEM mentoring ecosystem framework and a set of tools and exercises that help higher ed institutions to take stock of their mentoring, to look across departments, colleges, and offices, people, and say, where are our strengths and where are our areas of vulnerability as a campus? And so even with our very best STEM grant in place and lots of great mentoring happening, all of that work can be undermined by a vulnerable system. And so we use a couple different tools, including taking an inventory and then looking for places where we have really strong, robust resources. And we also study it for vulnerabilities and gaps. Maybe we keep relying on the same mentor sources, and with a few departures from the campus or some turnover, we would be in a very vulnerable situation, especially concerning our community college transfers or our students of color, our first gens. And so we actually use a lot of this systems that have been used in climate studies and public health, where they do heat maps and things of this nature. So if people like to learn more, we have a number of papers that are on the STEM mentoring ecosystem framework. And I think that that's really why I take both that interaction level and this macro level to say, if we have these micro interactions that we can really strengthen, both from a micro validation perspective, but also take into account some of the literature about how to frame critical feedback. If we were to do that more consistently across our broader ecosystem, we might be in a better position then to support not just our students, but to create these positive STEM climates that we want to work in. And so I'm happy to say that I have a second edition of my book coming out in the coming year. I'm working on the revision to that now, and we'll be glad to share additional information where I'm broadening to look at not just these populations that I have focused on, but also thinking about the mental health crisis, students with disabilities, and LGBTQIA students. And thank you so much also for these comments in the chat that I'm seeing. Yes, that it's kind of like, what's that fine line between promoting belonging and being overly positive about work that is not good enough, right? How do we help somebody see that this is part of a trajectory, and that a lot of working on science and engineering research is really about iteration. It's about coordinating meaning. It's about working together and making progress. And so we want people to feel validated to be part of that community, and also to point out some of the areas that they can grow and improve in, because otherwise it's not actually going to be a realistic trajectory for them. And so I'm very excited about oh, thank you so much. Yes. So I'm very excited about this work and kind of thinking about your broader network of campuses and kind of the ways that you're really making a difference in students' lives every day, and also thinking about this broader ecosystem that we can actually support one another, you know, in undertaking this work. Yes, my recommendation is to not overlook the mentor preparation. And that's what I've seen people do, is to really think about not just saying we're going to have a mentoring component or our scholars are going to have mentoring, but to really understand that just naming that you have a mentor program does not make mentoring, right? That there are so many advances in culturally sustaining mentoring, inclusive design, and universal design, and this broader kind of inclusive teaching, which recognizes positionality of the mentor. There needs to be more work in this area so that the mentoring efforts you're putting forward can be realized really in terms of practice. Yeah, it's very relevant. I do have some, Karen, thank you for this. And maybe when we do the follow-up, I'm going to be sending a PDF of the slides, but I also have a number of really good references. So if I can get just another day, I'll just pop in knowing now what's some of the things people are interested in. There's just some really good trainings, really good materials out there. And it's an area of continued need. So I would just say that sometimes we find something, but it's not like a one-stop shop, right? We can kind of pull from some different materials. Okay, I know they have to share the slide to tell you what's coming next in this series. So I just want to thank you so much for being part of this today. And I will also put my email in the chat. And there will be also a follow-up email where I can send some resources. So thanks so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Becky, and all the great comments. I'm so happy we're going to document all this. And once you get the resources, we will get those all out to you all. As you all know, we do have a series of our webinars. So our next webinar to start registering and getting these on your calendars early is what culture is relevant to STEM community college transfer students. It will be Wednesday, February 12th. So feel free to take a screenshot, or obviously we will be sending up follow-up information. This will also be there. And it will be led featuring Dr. Regina Delaman and Dr. Brenda Anderson. So we're really excited to kind of start continuing these conversations that are extremely critical for our community. So thank you all so much. And I will pass it over to Michelle to close it out.
Okay, thanks so much, Maria. And thank you again, Dr. Packard, for joining us. This was a fantastic discussion. I think you've given us so much to think about, and really appreciate you sending follow-up resources too as well. I think that's going to be very valuable. I want to just point everybody who's here to the chat. There is a little survey from our evaluator on this project just to give some feedback on our webinar and on the webinar series. We're popping that at the end of every webinar, so just appreciate everyone taking a moment to give us some feedback and also suggestions for future topics and directions that we might take this discussion in. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Thank you again, Becky, for the wonderful insights you've shared. And we'll look forward to hopefully seeing everybody again in February. Take care.